Hi, I'm Aron Bernstein. You already know that triads can sound stable or unstable depending on which inversion they're in. A root position C major chord sounds rock solid, very restful. Put it in first inversion though, and now it's not so restful, a little bit more temporary. And finally, put it in second inversion, and it's very unstable sounding. In fact, it sounds like it wants to resolve to this. So for today's lesson, we're going to look at the one chord in second inversion. It's very common near the ends of phrases, and we call it the cadential 6/4. Say hi to the perfect fourth.
Hi, how are ya?
It's a consonant interval, and like the perfect fifth and octave, was used as far back as the medieval period to double plain chant melodies. As time went on, however, the art of Western voice leading developed, and it became clear something was up with the perfect fourth. Here's a Renaissance motet by Josquin. When the bass arrives at B, it makes a perfect fourth with the soprano's E, and you can hear how unstable it sounds. The soprano holds that E until it resolves down to D sharp, turning our perfect fourth into a major third. So despite the consonants of the perfect fourth, in this passage it's very unstable.
Wait a minute.
And the top voice inevitably resolves it down to a third. This is called a 4/3 suspension, and it shows how in some situations a perfect fourth is treated as a dissonance. Here it is again in My Country 'Tis of Thee. There's our perfect fourth, C in the top voice over G in the bass, and listen again for that instability. The tension is released when the top voice resolves down, once again turning that unstable perfect fourth into a major third. In both of these examples, it happened right near the end of a phrase, where we would expect an authentic cadence. And that brings us to second inversion triads. As you know, they have a sixth above the bass and a fourth above the bass, which is why they're called 6/4 chords. Any major or minor triad in second inversion has a perfect fourth for its lowest interval, and as you might have guessed, that makes it very unstable. In this F major triad, the top note in the perfect fourth, F, wants to resolve down to E, making a major third, just like we saw before. But now we've also got a sixth on top of that, and it wants to follow suit, resolving down a step and making a fifth above the bass. The outcome? Our second inversion F major chord has become a root position C major chord. When the unstable perfect fourth dropped down, it was like the bottom falling out underneath the top interval, and that sixth also dropped. So what this means in the key of F major is that if we put our one chord, an F major triad, in second inversion, it can very easily resolve down into the 5 chord, C major. In real music, this is almost inevitable when the 1/6/4 chord appears right before a cadence. And with plenty of Clementi, you don't have to look far to find one. Let's stay in the key of F major and listen to this 1/6/4 resolve to 5 at the end of the phrase. By the time we hit the 1/6/4, it really doesn't sound like it wants to be a 1 chord anymore, and it quickly resolves to 5 on the next beat. That's because, for all intents and purposes, it already is a 5 chord. It just hasn't made up its mind yet. It's already got the root of the 5 chord, C, in the bass. And we've already seen how the upper voices are really just a couple of suspensions. A fourth down to a third, and a sixth down to a fifth, giving us our much-awaited 5 chord. So whenever you see a 1/6/4 right before 5, it's actually a delayed dominant, a 5 chord that's just settling into its job. And because it appears right before a cadence, it's known as cadential 6/4. Now, depending on who you talk to, you'll see it written either as 1/6/4 or 5/6/4. And which one is correct? Well, both in a sense. This certainly has all the notes of our 1 chord, but we now know it's really a 5 chord that got stuck in traffic. So for the rest of the lesson, I'll write it both ways, keeping in mind that the overall harmony in this whole measure is really 5. Moving on, cadential 6/4 is just as common in minor keys. Maestro? From 1/6, we go to 2/6, a very typical predominant, but instead of landing on 5, we hit cadential 6/4 first, before resolving to 5. And you might have noticed we have another 1 chord in second inversion much earlier, right here. Cadential 6/4 doesn't always resolve to 5 immediately. This one leads us on a bit of a journey before coming around to our final cadence. For now, though, let's zoom in on the voice leading as we approach the end of the melody. I've brought the melody down an octave just to get everything in close position. And notice how the tenor and bass voices merge here, and everything reduces to just 3 voices. This is actually quite common where a composer decides to thin out the texture. So from here on, it's just a bass line with 2 upper voices. The melody goes do, so, lay, fa, and reaches me on the cadential 6/4. That's our 6th above the bass. And the alto has do, the 4th. And just like in a major key, these are the 2 notes that resolve the cadential 6/4 into 5. In solfege, that's do down to ti, and me down to re. And you can write your cadential 6/4 either as 1/6/4 or this way, which has the advantage of showing the intervals in the suspensions resolving. 4th to 3rd, and 6th to 5th. In fact, writing the figured bass this way shows how even though cadential 6/4 may look like a second inversion 1 chord, it really is a 5 chord about to fulfill
its destiny.
Speaking of suspensions, a cadential 6/4 doesn't have to resolve to 5 all at once. Very often the 6th resolves down to a 5th first, and then the 4th resolves down to a 3rd, giving us a nice moment of dissonance. Here's our curmudgeon-y old pal to illustrate. Beethoven reaches a cadence in F sharp minor, and just like our previous examples, he precedes the 5 chord with cadential 6/4, but he resolves the suspensions one at a time instead of all at once. Again, this prolongs the resolution and provides some dissonance. Reduce this passage to block chords, and we'll look at the voice leading. Here's the cadential 6/4, which looks like an F sharp minor chord in second inversion. The alto and tenor have the 6th and 4th above the bass, but the alto resolves down first, 6th to 5th, creating a nice dissonant second with the tenor. Only afterward does the tenor resolve the 4th down to a 3rd, finally giving us the 5 chord. So this is a common way of resolving cadential 6/4, one suspension at a time. The Star-Spangled Banner could end with the same device. Here it is with cadential 6/4 resolving all at once to 5. And again, this time one suspension at a time. That brief dissonant second before the alto resolves down really drives the music home to the tonic. And while we're stopping over in the US, let's drop in on Scott Joplin for a cadential 6/4 that resolves not to 5, but 5/7. Here's the cadential 6/4, and we see our 5 chord is picked up a 7th. This is another common way to resolve cadential 6/4. Here's the voice leading. We're in A-flat major for this famous ragtime piece. This time we'll want to look at the upper 3 voices. The soprano and alto both start with the 6th, and the tenor's got the 4th. If we overlook the decorative skip down to do, the soprano resolves the 6th down to the 5th. Our tenor resolves the 4th down to the 3rd, and that gives us our 5 chord. But the alto does one better. This 6th doesn't resolve down to the 5th the way the soprano did. Instead, it moves up to a 7th above the bass, and this becomes the 7th of our 5/7 chord. So cadential 6/4 resolves just as easily to 5/7 as it does to plain old 5. To review, here's our cadential 6/4 in A-flat major. The 4th resolves down to a 3rd, just like before. The 6th resolves down to a 5th, and that'll give us a complete 5 chord. But if another voice also has that 6th, it can move up to a 7th above the bass, making a full 5/7 chord. Even more common would be this: 4th down to a 3rd, And then the top voice simply moves up to a seventh, and we don't even bother with a fifth. Remember, in any dominant seventh chord, the fifth is the tone we can omit if necessary. And that's exactly what Joplin does on the left hand in Maple Leaf Rag. So in figured bass, this is how we'll want to notate cadential 6/4 resolving to 5 or 5/7. Start with our initial intervals over the bass, then draw straight lines to show where they resolve to. Just a bit more practice before we call it good. Say yes to JS. This fugue ends with a nice and neat cadential 6/4 resolving to 5/7. We've got the expected fourth and sixth above the bass, but a tenor voice gives us an octave as well, and that's the voice that resolves down to the seventh. So this time we can write 5, 8, 6, 4, resolving to 7, 5, 3. Zooming in, let's check out the voices one by one. We're in D major. Here's the alto with the fourth. That resolves down to the third. Next, our soprano with the sixth. That becomes a fifth. And then the tenor with an octave above the bass. And that's going to step down to the seventh of our 5/7 chord. So that's how to handle the figured bass when your cadential 6/4 resolves to a complete 5/7. 8, 6, 4 to 7, 5, 3. Now, one final thing. Bach could easily have spread these resolutions out and handled them one at a time. First the sixth down to a fifth, then the fourth to a third, and last the tenor's octave down to the seventh. Once again, this consecutive resolution of voices really brings out the dissonance and makes the drive home all the more convincing. So that's the deal with cadential 6/4. Remember, it may look like a one chord in second inversion, but at the end of a phrase, it's really 5 that just hasn't thrown in the other shoe yet. A delayed dominant with a couple suspensions in the upper voices. Take a good shot at the worksheets and you'll get some good practice approaching cadential 6/4 and resolving it to its true self. High five.